she says.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so tonight, we're going to do the Mongols, the rise of the Mongols, who went from being a small nomadic tribe to establishing the largest land empire the world has ever seen in less than 70 years. So we're going to look at how they managed to achieve that. Defining historic Mongolia is difficult. Although there is a modern state known as Mongolia, the historic Mongolia's borders could be quite fluid. Mongolia, as the name of an actual location, only came into existence with the rise of the Mongol Empire. What is considered historic Mongolia is the Mongolian Plateau, where the steppe nomads lived for most of known history. It was the home of several empires, from the Xiongnu, which was 259 BCE to 91 CE, to the Uyghurs, who were there, whose empire lasted from 744 to 840 CE. Although all of these expanded beyond the Mongolian plateau, none had an impact or shared a legacy like the Mongol Empire. These empires kept the steppes as their focal point and largely remained there, while their predecessors also controlled sedentary populations. The Mongols controlled extensive peoples that easily dwarfed their nomadic population. Contrary to the popular idea that nomads simply wander the steppes with their herds and flocks, the life of a pastoral nomad was, and still is, quite different. Nomads do not wander. Rather, they migrate between seasonal pastures so as not to overgraze the land. In the steppes of Mongolia, the nomads relied on 5 animals, often referred to as the 5 snouts. The importance of the pastoral nomadic economy and lifestyle cannot be understated when studying the Mongol Empire. Sheep made up the largest portion of a family's livestock. They provided wool, from which nomads created felt cloth. Felting allowed them to form a solid cloth without the process of turning it into yarn and then weaving or knitting. From the felt, the nomads constructed their yurts, round tents made with lattice frame and then draped with layers of felt. The yurt size was limited only by the length of the roof beams and the amount of felt available. It could be constructed within an hour and was easily stowed in a cart or on the back of a camel, so allowing a sizable home while retaining mobility. The next animal in terms of quantity was the goat. As goats could subsist in areas with less pasture, their inclusion aided the nomads in times of drought. In addition, they could be milked and skinned for leather, and their soft undercoat provided cashmere. Goats, however, can damage pastures and so were kept in smaller numbers, except in areas where insufficient pasture existed for sheep. Both animals, however, nibbled the grass close to the ground, leaving little for other animals. Goats also eat the roots, contributing to the desertification of the steppes. The Mongol nomads learned how to properly manage the animals, allowing more efficient use of the same pasture without exhausting the grass. Oxen and yaks were also kept, but in fewer numbers. Groups that lived in higher elevations typically use yaks, or a crossbreed of cow and yak known as a kanag. They were primarily used as draft animals and rarely eaten. Their milk and resulting dairy products, however, were used extensively. Bactrian, or 2-humped camels, were highly valued as draft animals. They could carry Large loads of up to 180 kilos or pull loads exceeding 450 kilos. Possessing a special adaptation to eyelids and feet, pumps for water storage, and thick wool, the camel survived quite well in dry climates. Although the nomads used the wool and dairy products of the camel, the animal was rarely slaughtered due to its value as a draft animal, as well as its relative scarcity. A female camel's gestation period is considerable, 12 to 14 months. Camels simply do not breed fast enough to serve as a regular food source. Then there is the horse, which was essential to the nomadic life and was a key to Mongol expansion. The Mongolian horse is small, rarely more than 14 hands, which is about 56 inches at the shoulder. Horses were also pasture-fed, and an important fact was that the horse's combination of intelligence and hooves allowed it to dig through the snow or break ice when it covered the grass, allowing it to feed, and other animals often followed in its wake to graze during winter. While not necessarily the quickest of animals, it had incredible endurance. The value of a horse did not lie in how quickly it could run a race, but in the distance it could travel. Mongol children would be tied securely onto the horses from as young as 3, and so that they could ride without falling off while learning to control the animal. It was a steep learning curve, but one that resulted in the expert horsemanship that came to characterize the Mongols. The horses were well looked after. Everyone had them, and it was a grave offense to mistreat a horse in any way. In the 12th century, 5 tribal confederations or khanliks existed without a single one dominating. As well as the Mongols, in the West there was a large and powerful group called the Nayman. Nayman is the Mongolian word for 8, and it's believed that 8 Turco-Mongolian tribes made up their confederation, with their ruling elite being Turkic. We don't actually know what the Nayman called themselves. While a single Khan led them, his position was not absolute, and he primarily served as the first amongst equals. And there was a Keret, who probably also possessed a Turkic ruling stratum, and they controlled the central areas. In the late 12th century, the Keret Khan, Togrul, forged links with the Chinese Jin Empire. Some of the Nayman and the Keret had converted to Christianity in the 11th century. This particular branch of Christianity was the Church of the East, often derogatorily called Nestorian Christianity, and it was viewed as a heresy in Western Christendom. The Merkit were in the north, where they straddled the divide between the steppe nomads and the semi-nomadic forest tribes of Siberia. The Merkit kept a foot in both worlds as they fished, trapped, hunted, and kept herds of reindeer like the Siberian groups, but also were horse nomads like those in the steppes. They posed little threat to the other groups, but their mountainous territory and proximity to the forests of Siberia made it more difficult for steppe nomads to raid them. In the eastern steppes were the Tatars. At times they posed a serious threat to the Jin and tended to be viewed by them as the most dangerous group. The vast majority of the nomads were shamanic in religious practice. Shamanism is a primal religion which lacks a central holy text that will provide a defined set of rules or beliefs. It also does not have a transcendental afterlife in which everything is better. In shamanism, one's status remains the same in the afterlife. Powerful beings in the everyday world become powerful spirits in the spirit world. Shamans could be male or female. They were not priests, but healers and mediators. They dealt with the spirit world that often crossed into the physical world, usually at connection points which served as sacred spaces. Shamans underwent training with other shamans, not only in the appropriate use of rites and chanting, but to master entering the spirit world. Being the link between the physical and spiritual world, they could help spirits trapped in the physical world to escape. They also banished malevolent spirits and restored stolen souls to the sick. In Mongolian shamanism, the highest deity is Tengri, the supreme god of heaven, and he rules the other 99 lesser deities. The Mongol gods function primarily as protectors, so a protector of warriors, protector of horses, etc. There are limited resources on the Mongolian plateau, so often tribes would have to compete for them. Then from around 1180 up to the end of the 1190s, there was a period of warmth, causing intensive drought, which increased tension and conflicts. The warmth continued into the 1200s, but then came heavy rains, and this saw a surplus of grass. This meant people were able to have many more horses and other animals. Subsistence farmers were able to produce a surplus, and so provisioning a large army became feasible. It was not the defining factor in the expansion of the Mongols, but it certainly helped. To the south, there was the Jin Empire. Their policy was to continually meddle in the various steppe tribes, fighting each other, rather than from them to look south and interfere with their affairs. They also contrived to prevent any one group becoming dominant. In the late 12th century, it was the Tartars who were seen as the greatest threat, and the Jin Empire saw allies in the northern steppes to break their power. Much of the information we have about Chinggis Khan comes from the secret history of the Mongols, a mysterious text by an unknown writer, written sometimes after Chinggis Khan's death for the Mongol royal family. As such, it's thought that the information it contains is designed to be flattering to Chinggis and the Mongols. However, this text is considered to be a classic piece of literature and is still taught to school children in Mongolia to this day. What we do know is that Temujin was the eldest child of the clan leader Yasugai and his first wife Holun, who he had kidnapped from a Merkit clan. There is some dispute about the date of Temujin's birth, but most historians agree it was probably 1162. When Temujin was around 9 years old, he was taken by his father to the Kongregad clan, where a marriage had been arranged for him with a girl named Borte. The plan was that he would be put to work for his intended wife's clan until he reached the accepted age for marriage. This was unusual in that the boy would usually return home with his father. Arranged marriages between clans was one of the few ways that a balance of power was maintained. On the homeward journey, his father was poisoned by a group of Tartars. He became gravely ill on the journey home, and by the time he returned, he was on his deathbed. He sent a rider to retrieve Temujin, but was already dead before Temujin arrived. Temujin expected to take his father's place as leader, as Khan. Instead, he found that the clan had chosen a new Khan, who then expelled him and his mother along with his siblings and his father's other wife and children. Holun instilled in Temujin a sense of importance in the world and a passionate determination to avenge both his father's death and the loss of his rightful role in the clan. Temujin and Holun had a close relationship, and even when he was at the height of his power as Chinggis Khan, He delegated responsibilities and took advice from his mother. One of his half-brothers, Bektar, was at least 2 years older than Temujin. The Mongols practiced what is known as levirate marriage, in which the eldest son would marry his father's wives, excluding his own mother. This meant upon attaining his majority, Bektar could be Temujin's stepfather. In the end, Temujin murdered Bektar, but the exact reasons for this are obscure. When Temujin was about 13, he was captured by the Tayuchid and held captive for around 2 years. He managed to escape, and at 16, he became the Nokor, a personal follower of Togrul Khan, who was the dominant force in central Mongolia. Togrul had been the Anda, a kind of blood brother to Temujin's father, who had aided Togrul when he was in exile and restored him to power. He then returned to the Konograd clan to marry Borte, who he had been promised to by his father. Borte was kidnapped shortly afterwards by the Merkiks clan, seeking revenge for his father kidnapping Holin. One thing about Mongols is that they don't forget slights, and the revenge can take a long time. To rescue her, Temujin joined forces with his childhood Anda, Jarmuka. Jarmuka was an excellent general, and under his leadership, a heavily pregnant Borte was rescued. She gave birth to a son, Chosis, shortly after, and despite his uncertain parentage, Temujin accepted him completely as his own. Tensions then arose between Jarmuka and Temujin. The exact reasons are again not clear, but appear to have their roots in Borte and Temujin's ambitions. Jarmuka was often cruel, and Temujin had learned not only how to lead by following Jarmuka's example in battles, but also how not to lead, referring to his cruelty. Several of Jarmuka's followers had switched allegiance and joined him when he left Jarmuka. Jarmuka felt threatened by the speed which Temujin was gaining power. In 1187, he attacked Temujin and was victorious. Temujin was forced to take refuge in the Jin Empire for almost 10 years, and his protector, Togrul, was also exiled. Jarmuka dealt mercilessly with those who he defeated, including putting to death a group of 70 captives by boiling them alive. When Temujin returned, it was with the support of the Jin, and he became stronger as more of Jarmuka's followers switched their allegiance. Togrul also returned from exile, and with Temujin and the Jin, launched a campaign against the Tartars, who Temujin still had a grudge against. Its success saw Temujin and Togrul's dominate much of eastern and central Mongolia. But several Mongol leaders disliked Temujin, as he defied many social conventions, particularly in terms of social hierarchy. Instead of promoting people from just the upper strata of Mongolian society and from immediate family, he would promote on merit. This allowed people to gain rank and positions of responsibility who otherwise would have been stuck in a much lower strata of Mongol society. He also recognized skill and bravery in his enemies. Instead of simply killing those he defeated, he would often offer them positions within his own group, and many became his trusted aides. He also promoted women into positions of power and responsibility, breaking another taboo of Mongol culture. As his power spread, Jarmuka was chosen as the leader of forces opposing Temujin. Unlike Temujin, Jamuka had stuck rigidly to the ideals of the aristocracy. This time, Temujin gained the upper hand and defeated Jamuka's armies. In 1206, Jamuka was betrayed by some of his own men, who handed him over to Temujin. Temujin had the men put to death because for him the betrayal of the leader was the ultimate transgression. Temujin offered Jamuka the opportunity to renew their friendship and re-establish the bond they once had in their youth. Jamuka refused, saying that there was only room for one sun in the sky and only room for one Mongol lord. He was allowed to choose the method of his own execution and requested that he have his back broken rather than his blood spilled, which allowed him to achieve an honourable death. Temujin had achieved something that no one had ever done. He united the Mongol clans. In 1206, clan leaders came together to honour Temujin with the title of Chinggis Khan. The title means Oceanic Ruler of the Universe, or more commonly translated as Universal Ruler. This was much more than just an honorary title. Chinggis Khan's early success and the rapid expansion of the Mongol Empire was largely a result of his military expertise. The Mongol armies were different from anything the world had seen before in the way they organised and fought. The generals placed in position of command by Chinggis Khan were men who had earned their position rather than due to their birth. By doing this, he ensured that his armies were led by intelligent men who had the skills to adapt to circumstances and learn from experience. The key to understanding the Mongol army and how it differed from other armies of the time lies in the understanding the role of the cavalry. The Mongol army was mostly made up of cavalry, but unlike the heavy cavalry seen in other armies, such as the European knights, the majority were light cavalry who relied upon speed, mobility, and excellent archery. They did have heavy cavalry that they used to mop up the enemy. The Mongol cavalry was highly trained in complex maneuvers. They could fire arrows in all directions, including behind them, while riding at full speed, and were famous for this ability. They could time each release to precisely the split second when all four of the horse's legs were off the ground to attain a smooth shot. Each Mongol soldier had a number of horses, so he could always be sure of having a fresh, healthy horse on long journeys or when faced with unexpected combat. As mentioned, the horses held an almost sacred role in Mongol life. They were protected by extensive armour, and when a soldier died, it was not uncommon for his horse to be sacrificed so they could remain together in the hereafter. Here's some Mongolian cavalry performing on horseback. You see how they fire backwards, forwards, right, and all different ways. Imagine thousands of them. The Mongol soldiers had a wide range of weapons at their disposal, including several bows, a shield, a lasso, and a dagger or sword. Some carried long hooks to pull riders off their horses, and some carried maces. These weapons developed over time, and many of them were influenced by other cultures that they encountered as the empire spread. By far the most important weapon of the Mongol army was the composite Mongol bow. These were made from wood with a layer of horn on the inner side and sinew on the outer side. This gave the bow the perfect balance of resistance and compression, giving it excellent range as well as incredible precision. It is estimated that a Mongol bow could shoot an arrow up to 300 meters, an astonishing distance compared to other weapons of the time. Besides having more than one bow, and each archer wore a quiver that contained around 60 arrows, with extra quivers carried by the camels who were stationed nearby so the archers could restock quickly. A large number of arrows was needed because each archer would fire successive shots, reloading in seconds and attacking quickly so the enemy would be rained upon by a shower of arrows. They also carried different kinds of arrows. There was the normal iron-tip one, and there was a V-shaped arrow that was used to slice enemies, inflicting wounds, and in doing so caused terror. Finally, they carried an arrow with holes in it that whistled, and this was used as a signaling mechanism on the battlefield to direct the army. Unlike European armies of the time, which mainly consisted of peasants forced into service by their lord and carrying whatever they could lay their hands on, Mongol soldiers were given their weapons and were expected to keep them clean and maintain them. They were equipped with large saddlebags to keep their weapons and tools in that could also be inflated to help them cross rivers. They had armor of metal or hardened leather, depending on their rank, and trained in battle tactics. Genghis Khan was a great military strategist. He took into consideration what the enemy was thinking, basing his actions on how he anticipated the enemy would react. All of his military campaigns were based on logic, strategy, and a thorough knowledge of his enemy's motivations. For each battle, he would carefully weigh the risks and potential gains of engaging with the enemy before he attacked. He was not afraid to withdraw if he felt the risks outweighed the benefits, and would hold back until he could be reasonably sure of victory. He developed plans of attack that were often extremely complicated, that required great coordination, which is why communication was so important. Intensive training ensured that every soldier was familiar with the orders being communicated, so the whole army could move as one man, improving agility, which was crucial to many of the military maneuvers that made the Mongols so successful. Leaders and strategists positioned on hills nearby would literally oversee the battle and use this perspective to give complex orders. Other tactics include surprise attacks, sometimes against a much larger force, and feigned retreats. These were possible due to the agility and horsemanship, as well as the excellent level of training and coordination. Genghis Khan used psychological warfare to great effect, and this was partly why it's difficult for historians to get a realistic picture of the Mongol Empire. It is likely that stories of battles and conquests were greatly exaggerated by both sides. Genghis wanted to generate fear, as he preferred his enemies to submit willingly, and they were much more likely to do so if they believed that the Mongol forces were even more terrifying and merciless than they actually were. But there is no doubt that Genghis Khan could be brutal and unforgiving. The invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219 was one of the most vicious and ruthless in history. Initially, Genghis was content just to trade, but was provoked in 1218 when a Mongolian trade caravan of around 450 men arrived in the Khwarezm city of Otrar. It included his ambassador, but the governor of the city accused them of being spies and arrested them. With the assent of his sultan, he executed the entire caravan, and its goods were sold. A camel driver escaped this massacre to report back to Genghis Khan, who responded by sending a delegation of one Muslim and two Mongol diplomats to Sultan Muhammad, demanding that the governor be punished. Muhammad responded by beheading the Muslim ambassador and shaving off the beards of his 2 Mongol companions, which was a great insult. This provoked Genghis Khan's retaliatory invasion. Genghis besieged Otrar. Unlike most of the other cities that felt no loyalty to Sultan Muhammad, who had in the previous years conquered them, and they surrendered with little or no fighting. Otrar's garrison, on the other hand, resisted stubbornly for over 5 months. The city only fell when a traitor within the walls opened the gates to the besiegers and defected with part of his army. He and his men were slaughtered by the Mongols regardless. Again, he was betraying his leader. Mongols executed the governor, and it's probably apocryphal, but it said he was executed by having molten silver poured into his ears and eyes or down his throat. Nobody really knows. The fighters defending Otrar were all killed, as was the entire population of the city. Psychological tactics were also used in battle. These tactics included making the army look and sound larger than it was. Dummies would be placed on the backs of horses to give the impression of more riders. Bonfires would be lit to make the nighttime camp look more extensive, and lots of noise was generated using drums. This demoralized the enemy, and with shows of strength, silent attacks followed by deafening drum beats accompanied coordinated charges. One of the approaches that stands out the most when looking at Genghis Khan's military strategy is the policy of absorbing enemies into his own army. Enemies who submitted and were deemed worthy of inclusion in the Mongol army were spared death and joined the ranks of the army. An early example was the inclusion of an enemy who nearly caused his death. During his campaign to unify the clans, a soldier badly wounded Temujin. After the battle, he voluntarily confessed that it was he who was responsible. His bravery and honesty impressed Temujin, and he spared his life. He was renamed Jebe, which means arrow, and would become a faithful and loyal servant. Jebe turned out to be a master military strategist and won many important campaigns for Genghis. As the empire expanded, the Mongols encountered cities with large populations, walled cities. As they had nomadic origins, they needed to learn and adapt to the problems of siege warfare. One advantage they had was because of their nomadic culture, they were quite happy to surround the city, erect their yurts, and wait for the city to run out of food. Genghis was also keen to take up the technology he encountered on his campaigns. He purposely spared engineers and builders of weaponry so that he could benefit from their skills and put them to good use, developing new technology for the Mongol army. He was one of the first to use gunpowder in battles and adopted many new ideas for siege weaponry, such as trebuchets and mangonels, which are a type of catapult. His men didn't have to drag heavy siege equipment and machinery to the scene of a battle or siege. Instead, he ensured that by recruiting the best engineers, they could build efficient siege weaponry on site. As was the common practice of all armies of the time, cities that resisted were sacked and the population subject to the horrors of a victorious enemy. As the stories of the Mongols circulated, many cities, and in fact many whole regions, surrendered quickly without a fight and were spared. The options presented were simple and clear: be absorbed into the empire or face certain death. Unlike other empires of the period, Genghis Khan did not impose any restrictions on religious worship or local customs. The Mongols were highly tolerant of religions, and although he himself was a Tengrist, To avoid strife, Chinggis Khan set up an institution that ensured complete religious freedom in the empire. Under his administration, all religious leaders were exempt from taxation and from public service. Mongol Khans were known for organizing competitions of religious debates amongst clerics, and these would draw large audiences. He ordered that all religions should have a place of worship built in all cities of his empire, and that everyone had to respect the religious rights of others. He also appointed local governors from outside of a region who had different religion to ensure the even-handedness of his rule. The typical features of early Mongol governance. Firstly, Mongol leaders controlled all the upper levels of the government. But locals could advise Mongol leaders or manage the lower levels of government administration, and they actually, when they did, their advice was often taken. And in some areas, local princes could rule if they swore allegiance and paid tribute to the Mongols. And all this, combined with the religious and cultural tolerance, meant people were quite, a lot of the population were quite happy under Mongol rule. Not only was Chinggis Khan a great military leader, he also adapted and introduced many innovations to his empire. The Mongols had no writing system. They were all illiterate. But after defeating the Ugras, Chinggis commissioned a writing system based on their alphabet. He was a great believer in literacy and introduced the concept of writing to the previously illiterate people. A postal system was developed, consisting of a series of locations with riders and horses who would take messages and letters quickly to the next rider and so on until they reached their destination. It began as a military communication system, but later developed into a postal system for the empire. He introduced a system of paper currency, replacing the myriad types of currency available. Marco Polo reported on this and was astounded at the system that everyone accepted and that helped to develop trade. The Mongols were not farmers, but other parts of the empire where the land and climate were better suited to planting and harvesting saw a boost in agricultural activity. Chinggis Khan himself became convinced that settling down and planting the land could be a more prosperous way of life than nomadism, and so he encouraged it. The Mongols also ensured that the Silk Road from China to Europe was always protected, and the postal service would help in the communications. All empires, no matter how strong, eventually fall, and the Mongol Empire was no exception. Chinggis Khan died in 1227, but under his son Ogadai, it continued to expand until it reached its full extent in 1275. The Mongols struck fear into all who encountered them. The stark choice between surrender and pay tribute or be obliterated left no doubts as to the consequence of resistance. It was different. This was no different, really, to the Crusader sack of Constantinople and their massacre of the population of Jerusalem. It's just that the Mongols were far more thorough and far more efficient. Once there was a halt to Mongol expansion, infighting, assimilation, and the Black Death all contributed to its fall. Chinggis Khan had many sons, and his sons again had many sons through different wives. So there was always a lot of his family competing for a few positions. While many Mongol political entities persisted into the early modern era, for example, the Golden Horde Khanate lasted until 1783 when it was annexed by Catherine the Great. The empire shrunk and in 1368 was no more. Just So here's a quick, you can see how quickly it spread. Those were all split between siblings. Kublai Khan was the great Khan supposedly over all of them. And now the empire begins to disintegrate. So, to end with, we'll look at some modern Mongols celebrating their ancestors.
Ханга бидэнд харамгүй хишгэ хайрлаа. Ангийн магшуусай мэлаж сэтгэл сэрэгтэл хуур татсан.
And then